everybody. This is Carter, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the conversation series where I sit down and have a nice chat with fellow writers. And, you know, a lot of times I am talking to other novelists, other thriller novelists specifically, just because that's kind of me. That's kind of my network. That's who gets pitched to me, which is great. And I love talking about things that I write and I can directly relate to. But then other times I'll have nonfiction writers. I've had a science writer, and occasionally, like today, I have the profound pleasure of talking to poets. Um, I don't do that a lot, and it's not because I turn them down. I usually almost always accept a pitch with a poet because I'm fascinated by poetry and I have such high regard for it, even though, I'm guilty of not having read a lot of it over my life. But I do appreciate because there's such attention to the command of language within and the structure, and we talked about this in our conversation today. um, even the arrangement of poems within a book and how that can evoke different things in your reader depending on the way that you want to arrange it. And we likened it a lot to um, you know the old school albums when your favorite band would put out an album and there was real thought behind how the songs were arranged because it was meant to be listened to in a certain way. All this to say, I had the wonderful and talented Diego Báez on the show today. Diego is out of the Chicago area. He's got a really interesting story. His mother's from Pennsylvania, his father's from Paraguay, and so he grew up with these fairly disparate perspectives, which culminated into a lot of how he approaches his poetry. His debut collection, Yaguareté White, is out, and and it addresses a lot of those, experiences of his growing up, even if they might not all be from his direct perspective. And we talked about that too. A reader, I think, is going to normally assume, regardless of what they're reading, a lot of times, especially if it's not something like science fiction or fantasy, that the author is relaying a lot of their own experiences. And sometimes the reader doesn't give the writer license to use their empathy, to use their imagination, to write from experiences other than their own. And my ignorance would suggest that, particularly with poetry, because it feels so personal, that you are writing from your own perspective, and that's just simply not the case at all. You can write from many different voices to tell a story the way that you want to tell it as a poet. So we had a really interesting conversation. We talked about the business of poetry, the necessity of other work that you need to do, and we spent a lot of time talking about just how do you find those voices that you trust to give you feedback that is going to make you a better writer, because writing is not a solitary venture. If you spend your career writing in a vacuum, you aren't getting that feedback that allows you to become better. But you have to also develop the talent to identify those voices to listen to that will make you that better writer and not just send you in 1,000 different directions. So I really enjoyed talking to Diego. I think you're going to like this one. Folks, this is my conversation with Diego Báez. Where are you? Where do you live?
So I live up in Rogers Park. That's where I'm calling in from here. A little sunny studio, I guess.
Rogers Park, where?
Oh, sorry, Chicago.
Okay.
Just assume everybody lives in Chicago.
If you had said like Central Park, I would have been like, okay, I think I know where that is.
It's funny. I don't actually know. Surely there must be a Rogers Park, but I've never been there, like the actual park. So whatever.
It was named after Roger, and he had a little park, and it got overbuilt with suburban sprawl eventually.
That's right. Yeah.
Are you from that area?
So I grew up in Central Illinois. I've lived in Chicago though since, oh my God, 2020, or I'm sorry, 2010. So even longer. Yeah, 14 years now. And we moved up to Rogers. I don't know if you're familiar with Chicago at all, but Rogers
A
Park
little
is
bit.
about as far north as you can go until you're in the suburbs proper. And we moved up here in 2019, right before our child was born. So it's been
Okay. Okay.
a while. Yeah.
Good place to raise a kid.
So far, yes. So far. Ask me again next year when she starts in the public schools, and we'll see.
Yeah, it's such a consideration. I remember when we first had kids, back in 2003, prior to that, we had been living in Miami a little bit, and we're like, this is not this is not the place to raise a kid.
Yeah.
So we moved to Colorado, and it makes all the difference in the world. But there's always, you never know. It's always a crapshoot. So
Yeah. Yeah.
now you're you're of Paraguayan descent, like on one side, right?
That's right. That's right. My dad is from Paraguay. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Do you go back there often? You have a lot of family still back there?
So my the whole side of that family lives there still. He's the only one who's come over. He has now 8 siblings, and all their spouses and kids are all over there. So we've got dozens of folks there. I grew up, we would go as a family every couple years. So every like 3 or 4 years, we would go down and spend like a month, between sort of the end of the fall semester, beginning of spring. We'd go down for like a month and live there. The last time I was there was the last week in February 2020. And
Okay.
by then, COVID was a thing, but it wasn't
Yeah.
the pandemic yet.
The last
And
week of February 2020 was pretty much the cutoff point for any kind of travel.
yeah, yeah. And I remember, I mean, I landed back in the States, and by the end of that week, I was at a meeting at my college where I teach, and that was the last in-person meeting we had that I guess I've been to in a while, because then things shut down, and I haven't been back since. I hope to return, probably not this year, honestly, but next year, hopefully.
Yep. 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 For sure. So I'm interested in your journey as a poet, and first I want to make sure you tell me with the correct pronunciation the name of your debut collection.
Yeah, it's Yaguareté White.
Yaguareté White.
Nice.
Got it. My ex-wife is from Argentina, so I know a little. I knew enough to be dangerous, but I see certain words, I'm like, I'm not even gonna. I'm
Oh,
not even. And is that, just out of curiosity, is that, when you're thinking about naming a collection and you have what I consider to be a challenging word right on the cover, is that a discussion with your publisher?
well, it's funny. In retrospect, I'm realizing like, yeah, let me give my first book a title that no one can pronounce. That seems like a good smart move. But truthfully, the title for this collection came out of a conversation with a dear friend who had read an earlier version of the manuscript. My friend, a brilliant poet, Rosebud Benoni, I gave her the manuscript back in, I guess it was around 2020 or so, and it had a different title. The title was Valleys Full of Jaguars.
Hmm.
That's taken from actually an Argentinian Cesar Aeda's novel, Ama the
Hmm.
Captain,
Hmm.
and it's actually referring to Paraguay in the novel, which I found ironic because jaguars no longer live in Paraguay. They don't. I mean, they are
No.
there, but not nearly as much. And so I called it Valleys Full of Jaguars. Ironically, Rosebud read the book and she was like, "Diego, there's no jaguars in your book.
Where the Jaguar.
Yeah, you need to think of a different
She
title."
wasn't appreciating the irony of it.
It wasn't landing. It wasn't happening. So I was like, okay, noted. And instead of I chose this title, Yaguareté White, which comes from Yaguareté, comes from an indigenous Guarani word, which means jaguar.
Mhm.
Um, and I felt like I needed to address not just like the Paraguayan side, but also the fact that my mom is from Pennsylvania. She's a white woman from Pennsylvania. And so that has also informed my, how I move through the world and how I experience a lot of things. And so to kind of pair them together, I felt like, let me use this I also like, I like the way the word looks. It starts with a Y. It's got an accent. I like the way it
It's a
looks.
beautiful word. Yeah.
Yeah, paired with something though that is familiar and in fact maybe a little provocative or a little bit like, in fact, I was at a conference. I was at the AWP conference earlier in February last month, and I had somebody who had walked by the table where I was signing books at the time, and she gave one look at the book and she said, "Is this about white people?" And I said, "I mean, it is in a lot of ways, it is." And I said, "Yeah, it is." And she said, "Good luck with that," and kept walking. I was like, "Oh, snap! Okay,
Wow.
I got a reaction. That's yeah."
What an odd thing to say.
I know. I know. I was like, "You don't want to buy it? Okay, fine."
Right, right. So you're growing up in the Midwest. You've got an American mother and a Paraguayan father. Yeah, and I know a lot of that experience growing up kind of informed your thoughts on how you approached writing. But what, just in terms of writing itself, was there a pull for you at certain point? Do you have a recollection of like, oh, I was in eighth grade and I had this teacher who really encouraged me? Or I'm always curious to know what that kind of inflection point was, if there is one.
Yeah, I think the earliest hints of that, when I was in kindergarten or maybe like 6 or 7, I remember wanting to be an archaeologist
Hmm.
because dinosaurs are rad, but also the word
Mhm,
itself really was appealing to me. It's got all those vowels linked together, and
mhm.
I can remember this very well, like linking the sounds together in my head, archaeologist, and just that making a lot of sense and being very like, I don't know, it touched a nerve in my brain that I can't otherwise describe. It's just like being very, very enjoyable. And I should have known though at that point that it wasn't that I wanted to be an archaeologist, because I was interested in language because I liked the
Right,
sounds of the word,
right.
and did very well in all my spelling tests, in first grade. But it
Mhm,
wasn't until like eighth grade or set, no, I'm sorry, seventh grade. It would have been in Central Illinois at the time. We'd go elementary school and then middle school and then high school. And so it was like right as I was getting into middle school, I encountered the work of Edgar Allan Poe and
mhm,
also Eminem, which maybe I
mhm.
should have been listening to as a seventh grader, but oh well. And I just remember for some reason reading or listening to and reading them at the same time, appreciating the different rhyme schemes and how, a lot of what I guess I had read up until that point was a little more straightforward or more, I don't know, more basic or whatever, but learning that you can play with where words go and how they rhyme and resonate and almost mirror each other together with Eminem. I mean, a lot of problematic figure, but also very funny in a lot of ways. Like I say, problematic, but
Very
also funny.
excessively clever.
Here you go. That's a much better way to say it.
Yeah.
That really rang true for me, and I thought this is interesting. This seems like an interesting way to like spend time. This seems like an interesting thing to do, and I guess that really was. It was like that was like the first moment of like, oh, there's fun things one can do with language. Let me see if I can do some of them as
Yeah.
well.
Well, and what a duality to kind of have those moments of consideration, because you have somebody like Poe who, just being a writer in the 19th century, you were going to have much more verbosity, right? You're going to have 40-word sentences. And then you have Eminem and rap and hip hop in general, where it's what's so, I think, enticing a lot about the lyrics of rap is how pithy they are. Like, you've evoked this feeling, you've made this message in 3 words
Right.
that rhyme.
Yeah.
And that's amazing. So, that's a real contrast, but it's also just kind of a fascination with the study of language in general, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I never really appreciated how contrasting they actually are too. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah, I remember falling deep for Poe in in my college years, and it all, not all of it resonates, right? But there's certain parts of it you're just reading, you're like, this is this shouldn't be as compelling as it is, given the density of the language, given the time period, given how
Yeah.
many words you don't even necessarily know, but you're just like, how do, and when you sit to study language, I always use Cormac McCarthy as an example of this. You read a Cormac McCarthy novel and you're like, how is he making me feel this way?
Yeah.
And you
Exactly.
try to deconstruct the sentences, and the best writers, you can't. You're just like, I don't know. This sentence, I don't even really know what it means, but it's having a visceral effect on me, and I'm jealous of that kind of writing, and it's amazing. I don't know if it's, do you think something like that is just natural talent, obviously born out of years and years and years of writing and practice, or do you think it's like somebody can, like, I can really create a voice, I don't know, purposefully,
Yeah.
and
I
have that effect?
Well, I'm thinking of Cormac McCarthy, and I remember really clearly reading Sutri, and
Mhm.
part of that takes place in Knoxville, Tennessee. And my wife is from Knoxville,
Hmm.
but long before, actually long before we met and before I'd been to Knoxville, I remember reading a passage where one of the characters is like just sitting along a riverbank, and it's one of his more like sort of flowery, like purpley, poetic books, and it's this long passage about sitting in the sunlight by the riverbank, a place I'd never been, I'd never really even thought about. But like you say, I'm like I'm feeling like I'm there. I'm feeling the heat and the humidity and like the mosquitoes. I'm sitting in, central Illinois in the middle of winter reading this.
Mhm.
It's so evocative. I think an earlier, maybe like you asked me that question 10 years ago, I think I would have erred more on the side of like natural talent or ambition or like, genius or whatever. But I think that can only take one so far. I think
Yeah.
that having having spent a long time on one book, but also just, having friends and sort of seeing their cadences, but more so their practice, I wish I'd have known how much time and energy my favorite writers really put into creating even individual poems, let alone sequences of poems or entire books. I think that sometimes the muse strikes and you can pop out a poem relatively quickly and it might even arrive mostly baked. But I
Mhm.
just feel like, especially if we're talking about putting a book together, maybe other poets are different. They like to just sort of do a compilation of the best of or the best hits or whatever. But with Yaguareté White, what I really wanted to do was build a book that works together. And there are some poems that don't, if you pull them out of the book, they don't really make much sense. They don't, I mean, they're
Right.
not as interesting. And so I really feel like it's worth, I mean, I can't tell my past self this, but I wish I could have pulled younger Diego out and said, look, these books that you're reading that you're so impressed by, that you're so taken by, they take weeks and months and years and hours and hours and hours of
Right.
architecting it together before you get something that multiple readers have to read and give you feedback on. And I feel like that might be maybe it's not so much anymore, but I feel like it was a myth when I was especially coming up through like college and even grad school, which was that like writing is this solitary act. You do it on your own. You belabor it and you get stressed out about it, and then either people like it or they don't. But what I have found to be true is that the more people who are reading the work and giving input or feedback, the better writer I become. Like I need other people.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no question about that. I think you totally nailed it there, because you have no context of whether you're improving. Just because you wrote a million words doesn't mean the second 500,000 were any better, because you don't know. You might be doing the same horseshit you were doing all along, because you're not getting that input and that critical feedback. And if you're just writing for yourself, that's totally cool. But like, I feel like it wasn't until my third published book, so my sixth actual book, where I felt like, oh, that's my voice, but it took, I wouldn't have, I needed all those other books to get to that point. And but you need somebody telling you, this is what works, this is what doesn't work, this is how I feel when I read your work. That's super. And knowing who to listen to, that's a skill. That's because when you're first starting out, you listen to everybody, and you end up rewriting stuff that it becomes garbage, because it has no soul to it, because you have 1,000 different opinions. I don't know if you kind of, and I think with poetry, it's got to be, I'm so curious about it, because I think giving a layman's critical analysis of poetry is terribly difficult,
Right.
because it feels more subjective than maybe analyzing a genre novel.
Yeah.
Um, so is it, how do you cultivate those ears? How do you cultivate the people who you can really rely on to give you feedback?
Yeah, man, that's a good question because I was thinking about what you said, and it really is about finding people you trust. Like
Hmm.
you have to value their opinion and trust that they not only know what they're talking about, but have, without sounding cheesy, to have your best interest in mind. You know what I mean? I went to a poetry school in Rutgers, or in Newark at Rutgers, and the MFA program there puts a bunch of us write, like 12 of us writers in a room, and we all read each other's work. And I can tell, or I remember, I mean, this was a long time ago, but I remember being able to tell pretty quickly, like on a first read, if a person's voice or the project or whatever they were working on was going to be like for me, and if I was going to be able to give feedback that would be useful to them. Sometimes it
Hmm.
wasn't, because they were just doing something that either I didn't understand or I understood it, but I didn't really, it wasn't really my thing.
Hmm.
And in those cases, I don't know, I feel like maybe I thought I was doing them a favor by self-censoring a bit. Like, I don't need to tell you that I don't like this. That doesn't help you.
Right.
I kind
And
of
you
think,
can still get good feedback while not liking it.
yeah, absolutely. And I am also a book critic, and I try to practice that as well. Like, I read a lot of
Hmm.
books that, like, I wouldn't have read this if I hadn't been assigned it. But that doesn't mean I need to, like, that shouldn't be, who does
Right.
that help for me to be like, this isn't what I like? That's not helpful.
Right.
But like giving that feedback, that, or just giving an opinion that is like, well, here's who might like this, or here is what I think is working. And for me, it's been, I'm just trying to think about those relationships, because I don't know if you did a like an MFA program, but it's so
Mm-mm.
intense. And I was relatively young at the time, and it can be confusing because you get
Yeah.
all these voices that you're sort of valuing all at the same time. I think for me, it was the voices of folks who, how do I say, their voices have continued. So like they're
Hmm.
still in my life, or I still read their work, or I still admire them as like people.
Hmm.
And those are the voices where, even if even if what I'm hearing doesn't exactly align with like the vision I had for the piece, I can still hear it in good faith,
Yeah.
right? And I can take from that what is going to be useful then for a revision, or scrapping it or doing it again differently. But it is so crucial for writers to find those folks whose voices they, yeah, like you say, cultivating that ear for like, how do I know that what you're telling me is actually going to be is going to be useful?
Right. And then the exact opposite side of all of that is knowing how to trust yourself.
Mm.
And that I think is even a harder thing to do. So I started writing out of the blue in my 30s, like literally no training, no aspirations. I just started on one day. And so I came from complete and utter ignorance. And so I needed a lot of time alone just to, you know, write words to get to a point where I'm like, okay, I'm competent, not good, but competent. And then I start looking for feedback. Um, but because of that, I come from such a place of self-doubt and imposter syndrome that it took me years and years and years to even tell people I was writing, much less publishing books, because you feel like a fraud. And it's really so important to trust your voice, but that comes over time, I think. You're too busy listening to everybody else talking about your work, and so now I feel like a first pass of everything is trusting your voice, and the second pass is that's where you have the critical analysis, and you try to be objective about it, and you get also alpha and beta feedback. I don't know what your process is like that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Because when one starts to trust one's own voice, then you can like open yourself up to feedback. Sometimes it's got to be critical. Sometimes you need someone to be like, I've literally had, I have two close friends who we do workshop every month, and I've had them like, we'll be sharing the screen or whatever, and they'll pull it up and
Mhm.
say, highlight. My one buddy will highlight the passage, and be like, Diego, I don't know what this means. This doesn't make any sense. I'm like, yeah, I don't. And sometimes I don't have an explanation either. And it's like, he kind of caught me. I don't really know either. I just thought it sounded good.
Yeah.
But to do it in that spirit is so, because 15 years ago or whatever, I would have taken that very personally. I've been
Yeah.
like, oh, that's an attack on me, and like, but no, it's not. It's really coming from a place of like, as your reader, this didn't land. Can we, what, like, why? How did it not? What else needs to be there? What else do you need to say, or how can you say it differently?
But I feel like, yeah, and I always find poetry so fascinating, when you contrast it to, for example, writing a novel. Um, when I think about poetry and a collection of poetry, there's there's so much I think that ties into like how people used to produce albums. Certainly thinking about the not only obviously the lyrics, but the placement. Like you were just talking about earlier, like if you pull one poem out of context, it doesn't really work. And that is gone obviously with albums. Now you just get a single song. But the idea that it was really cultivated, and this is how it's supposed to be listened to in this order because it's meaningful like this in no other way. I feel like poetry is almost like there's got to be a lot of thought process behind a collection and the placement of works within the collection. How do you go through that process?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because as you were talking, I was thinking about my favorite albums growing up. I know this is not the question you asked, but I'm just thinking about this.
No,
The
yeah,
favorite albums growing up were a lot mostly hip hop albums that included a lot of like skits and interstitial material and like
right.
intros and outros.
I think of De La Soul. Yeah,
Yeah, totally. Yes.
yeah, yeah.
And Wu-Tang, they did also many
Uh-huh.
interesting like samples from movies and stuff. But I remember getting to college, and would have been like a couple of years into college, undergrad, and a friend really being just really interested in concept albums and like going out of their way to explain what a concept album was to me. And I was like, "Oh, you mean like an album where like it's put together in a way that tells a bigger picture than just a bunch of
Right,
songs."
right. Like Tommy. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so I was just thinking of a book that came out last month, I believe, called American Inmate by Justin Rovio Monson, a poet who is currently incarcerated in Michigan right now. But
Mm.
he works into the whole book. He's got liner notes, he's got intros and outros, he's got like um, certain poems are featuring samples from different artists like Jay-Z or De La Soul or etc. And it really spoke to me. It spoke to me way more than I think I was prepared for, because I just felt very seen from my own musical tastes, and then the work is good as well. Um, for for me, I've only got the one to go off
Hmm.
of, and it took a long time to put together. Some of the poems are very old. Some of them I wrote like right before sending the manuscript off to the press. But I knew, I think even going into it, as I was thinking about it as a project, I knew two things. I knew that I needed to address the Paraguayan side and sort of the Caucasian or whiteness, both how I experience it personally, but also how it operates more broadly in society or societies. There was that. And I also knew one of the earliest notes I got on these kinds of poems I was writing was not to separate them out. I had in grad school, I had written a little bit of like, these are like the ethnic poems and these are like the language poems. And my mentor at the
Mm.
time said, you need to be doing both. Do them both at the same time, because that is how I live my life. I don't live my life
Right.
being white in some spaces and Paraguayan in another. It's all at the same time. And so like that was the first, I think that informs a lot of how the book came together. But then the other piece was much, much later on, like much more recently, thinking about it in terms of sections or like movements. And I
Hmm.
think what I wanted to do was introduce readers to this place that probably most of them have not been to. And so to kind of recreate what is that experience of like flying down to Paraguay and entering this world that is both very familiar, and I would, like as a person, I would call that a home of mine, but
Hmm.
also it's very strange and in a lot of ways unfamiliar. And I don't actually live there. I don't necessarily belong there in that same way. So kind of trying to recreate that for the readers until we get into the book and towards sort of the second half or like two-thirds of the way in, trying to confront some uncomfortable legacies of colonialism and
Hmm.
whiteness and the American empire and like weightier, sort of heavier topics like that.
Yeah.
Uh, and I hope that sort of gradually introducing those pieces, and then I hope the book sort of also ends on a little bit of a more, I guess it's optimistic, maybe it's lighter, I'm not sure, some more like, I don't know, lovely family poems, which it
Yeah.
seems like a weird kind of combination, but
Well, a lot of it's feeling, right? A lot of it just like this, you hit certain passages and you almost need to break yourself. And you're realizing by doing that, you're giving the reader permission to step away or cleanse their reading palette for a little bit, because there is still pacing when you're talking about poetry. There is still storytelling. But I'm curious what you said a little bit earlier, just how you 10 years ago you would have taken certain feedback much more personally. My ignorance leads me to believe that I think it would be easier to take feedback more personally as a poet, because I feel like poetry is so personal, even though novel writing is exceptionally personal as well. Um, but I feel like if I want to write something as a poet and you don't understand it, that's not important to me. And that might be a completely stupid statement to make, but I do. And again, maybe I'm likening it a little bit to a lyricist who is like, you think about some of your favorite lyrics, like, I don't know if I know what that means, but it really speaks to me. Um, is that, is that something? Does that make sense?
For sure. Oh, absolutely. And huh, I think that past me, or man, and sometimes even today, has a harder time accepting that decisions that I have made about the piece itself, about a particular poem, decisions that
Mhm.
I have made about which word choices to use or which sort of perspective to write from, because all those things, they're familiar from fiction as well. But those are decisions that I've made. And I think that my earliest workshops, I would take it very personally, because I was like, well, I made that, like you said, I made this decision for a reason. And if you don't get it, that's your problem. But like, that's such a self-centered, narcissistic, not very generous way to write. Like,
Mhm.
I do some writing for myself, but though that writing, these poems in particular are for other people. And so actually, if an audience or a reader doesn't get it, that's my problem. It's the
Yeah.
writer.
It's information at least to have, and it's a data point, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And so no matter how personal or how closely aligned the speakers of any given poem are to the actual writer themselves, like some of the poems in the book is basically me, like it's more or less me. Others of them are not. Some of the speakers are very, very far removed from my own experiences, right? I still need to be able to hear like an editor or another reader or a friend or my own my own self-critical apparatus needs to be able to recognize certain decisions that are better than others, but it's that better piece, which is like, kind of depends what you're going for, right?
Mhm.
And I don't know, it's hard too within poetry because, first of all, people in the US who read on a regular basis, and that's already pretty small. People who
Right,
are reading
right,
poetry is even smaller. But I
right.
will tell you that the people who do read poetry are also often the ones who are producing it. And
Mhm.
so we get a lot of the people who I hope will read the book are also people who are writing poetry
Right,
themselves.
right.
And so I'm especially interested in my family, and they've all read it now, and I've gotten their thoughts. In fact, like you said earlier, it's like poetry is so much more personal, and some of the poems are written from like it's literally me. But my mom and dad, they're split up now, but they read it separately, the book, ahead of publication, and both of them, the first feedback was like they're very proud, great, they're proud of me. But they both had just notes they wanted to share with me, like things like that didn't happen to you, that happened to so and so, my other brother, or my mom
Right.
wanted to
It's
correct
called
me.
literary license, mom.
So that's been funny and kind of amusing and rewarding though, because like now other people are reading it too, and it's a little, maybe I don't know what it's like to publish a novel. Maybe it's a little bit scarier because there is stuff in there where it's like some of that's fact, but a lot of it's not.
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah, and you
yeah.
can't control how people think about it, right? And because my mom is super convinced of like writers write what they know, because that's the old stupid axiom that is absolutely untrue. And so she'll question me on things. And I'm like, I've just written about a serial killer who literally crucifies people. I can tell you, as far as I know, I've never done that. But and so I found in myself a desire to start sounding less and less like me,
Mm.
um, because there's a freedom, I think, associated with that. So I started writing predominantly from a female point of view, and I found it just opened up my world, because it was so freeing. And it was just, yeah, and I think if you do have natural wells of empathy, you're able to do that. Um, because I was just so tired of like, oh, I totally see you in this. But from a poet's perspective, it's such a self-reflection often that people wouldn't, even if it's not, people assume it is, I would think,
Oh
unless
yeah.
it's so obviously not you. I think they'd be like, oh wow, didn't know you felt like this.
I
You're like,
know.
well,
And
I
and
don't,
I
but my character does.
exactly right. I just read a book like literally earlier today called Santa Tarantula, which is a new book. I don't think it came out just yet. I think it comes out this month by Jordan Perez,
Mhm.
and she is a writer who also does a lot of really important work in the space of sort of preventing child sex abuse and child sex crimes and stuff. It's like such important, such traumatic, such serious work.
Mhm.
And the poems they're incredible, first of all. It's like one of the best books of the year.
Hmm.
But some of the speakers, I had like literally the same sensation that you just had, or that you just kind of described, which was like, wait a minute, I thought you were like the writer of the book, you were this person. Now it's true, the author does this good work, but that doesn't mean that all the speakers are exactly aligned with that. Some of the speakers make statements or have opinions or observations that are doubly jarring. First of all, because it's like uncomfortable subject matter, but also then because I'm trying to always connect it to who the author is, but also like cut that off, right? And give the
Right.
author the respect that they deserve to make those same decisions that I try to make too. Those take, like you said, take that license or take those liberties that make for better work, I think.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's difficult because, the casual consumer of literature or poetry just kind of always is constantly thinking about the author, or they'll say, wow, he wrote a woman better than I would have expected. I'm like, well, I didn't write necessarily a woman. I wrote a human being who's in
Yeah,
this
right.
situation, and I think we can all empathize with that. But you can't control that kind of thing. I'm curious, just kind of going back to what you were talking about, general readership being not great and mostly female leaning, and then when you get to poetry, it being even less. As you're as you're completing your MFA years and years ago, are you thinking about the commercial aspects of writing? And because it's I mean, let's face it, it's a terrible industry no matter what you're writing. I mean, it's beautiful, and it's a great calling, and I think it's important, but on a commercially viable basis, it's a real existential struggle. Um, what was your thought process, finishing your MFA?
Yeah. I was, even by then, I was super aware of the fact that uh, unless one is independently wealthy, you're doing something else while you're writing, in most cases, especially true for poetry.
Regardless of what you're writing, I think it's
Exactly.
important to you
Yeah,
could be the most commercial, mystery writer, most likely you have another job.
exactly. Most of my models were teachers or faculty or professors or
Mhm,
whatever.
mhm,
And so I thankfully, luckily, I did get the chance to teach a bit at the local community college in Essex County in Newark. I was able to teach some like their pre-credit reading and writing courses. And that experience, I'm so grateful for that because it showed me and I believe this still to today, because that's why I still teach, is that is not the worst way to spend some time
mhm,
earning money. In fact, it's
mhm,
a pretty good use of my time. Like if I'm going to be doing anything, this is a really rewarding way to spend some time. And so I was ready for that and prepared, and that's how I've lived my life ever since. I've been a teacher primarily and a writer.
mhm,
As for like the commercially viable part of writing, so much poetry is published without really much money at all changing
mhm,
hands. So it's not necessarily about that, but I will say that I also feel very fortunate that I had other pathways that again haven't sustained a lifestyle, but also are not totally voluntary. So getting into book criticism was really, it's been a joy, it's been a challenge. It's also been again another one of those ways where like, look, if I'm going to read all these books of poetry anyways, which I should do and I like to do,
mhm.
maybe if I'm reading them for review, then I'm also getting paid. It's not a living wage. It's not even like minimum wage, but it's more than nothing, right?
Yeah, it's
It's
supplementary income. Yeah.
exactly, yeah, exactly. And so I write a lot for a magazine called Booklist, which is for
Oh yeah.
librarians.
Yep.
Yeah, and I love it because the goal of these reviews isn't to like trash it or talk it up. It's really more to find an audience, to find a public who might enjoy the book. And so for me to read, I read, I don't know, maybe a couple dozen poetry titles a year for book list. And number one, I get to read them ahead of time, which is nice. I get the books for free, which is nice. It has also really informed my own sensibilities, right? I read someone else's writing and I'm like, oh, I like what they're doing. I want to copy this or like do my version of that.
Hmm.
And by that same token, I read stuff where it's just like, I see what they're doing. I can appreciate it. I can talk about it in a way that other people might enjoy it. That's not what I'm going to write. And that's good for me to know as well, to like know
Yeah.
where I don't know, where those lanes are, I guess. Yeah.
And having produced your own book, was that reviewed by Booklist? And do you know that person who reviewed it?
No, I don't. It was reviewed by Booklist, which I'm very grateful for, and I really appreciate the insights and like this is so silly. I've been saying this a bit to people, but maybe I shouldn't because it seems silly. But the reviewer used a term that wasn't part of my vocabulary. I'd never described a poem as a memory poem,
Hmm.
but even like it's so straightforward. It's just like it's literally just like a speaker remembering something that happened. But the reviewer used that terminology in the review, and it's like, oh yeah, no, that is what a lot of the book is. It's just like I hadn't thought about it that way for some reason, but like
That's
having a name
funny.
for it is helpful, I guess.
That's interesting. And do you only review poetry collections, or do they ask you to review other types of books as well?
I used to review a lot wider purview of books. I've reviewed novels, I've reviewed a lot of poetry, so mostly poetry, some
Yeah.
fiction, but also some nonfiction. And I think the nonfiction is where it's been most uh varied, I guess. Like
Hmm.
some of the most I just read a book called Latino Land, I think, by a reporter whose name or journalist whose name I escapes me, unfortunately, but uh, it was such an interesting way of talking about just demographic shifts and demographic phenomena in the US. And I would never have picked this book up just off the shelf on my own. And so I
Hmm.
was able to encounter it. I've also read a couple, again, it's not about trashing them or talking them up necessarily, but a couple nonfiction or like memoir titles by Latino or Latinx influencers, more or less. They're
Hmm.
like social media people. And I read it and, I'm like, some of these sentences are not the most interesting, whatever.
Right.
But again, my job isn't to necessarily just to trash the lack of, variety of sentence structure or whatever. It's to say, look, this book might be interesting for like these people who are this age or
The
interested in.
followers. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm grateful to have read it, but again, those are maybe not the titles I'd have picked up myself.
Yeah, I find that fascinating, the confluence of social media and writing, in the sense it just goes either way, right? Like you could be a writer first, and then you have all this pressure to have some kind of presence, and then to moderate that presence and to make sure you're staying relevant. And that's not in the wheelhouse of most writers. Then you have people who blow up on social media, and either they're told to, or they get in there, you should write a book and capitalize on this because this might not last very long. And lo and behold, maybe they're not so great writers. um I spoke to, and I'm going to forget her name, and she's actually a great writer, but she started on TikTok and got all these followers, just kind of making up stories and telling the same story, and then instant New York Times bestseller. And and to her credit, she's a great writer, so I don't take anything away from her, but like, you see the power of social media, and how influencers, I go through PR campaigns where the PR team's like, we're targeting influencers to help spread, who read books, you book influencers. And you're like, oh, that's a thing. Like, I,
Yeah.
I didn't even know, but it's the world we live in. I think it's interesting. Would do you have any desire to write fiction, write a novel, alongside your poetry?
So I spent the last, I guess, 12 to 14 years getting this book together in various, sometimes I'd work on it a lot, sometimes I wouldn't think about it for months at a time. in the interim, I was writing some fiction. I've published, in various online and in print places, short fiction, flash fiction, little story, like some short stories. I will say that I guess I had a version of the book or the manuscript together in like 2017, 2018, or I thought I did.
Mhm.
And until I gave it to some other readers who gave me some really important feedback, and I'm so glad that it continued to evolve to the shape it is today. But in the interim there, I was very interested in writing a science fiction novel around time travel. I'm very interested in
Mhm.
time
Mhm.
travel. And I've had fits and starts where I've got, a couple thousand words here, a couple thousand words there. Um, but then once this Yaguareté White kind of picked up steam, that would have been like the first glimmerings of like a maybe this is going to be a thing kind of happened around 2021, 2022. And since then, I have just been way more invested in poetry. I've got some ideas
Mhm.
for. I'm working on a chapbook, so a smaller, sequence of poems. I'm already starting to think about like what was left on the cutting room floor, right? The offcuts from Yaguareté
Mhm.
White. What else is there to say, or what other ways into this identity or conundrum or whatever? Um, Still, though, in the back of my mind is this idea for a time travel novel that I've been thinking about for a long time, but I will tell you, it's just, and my buddies try to get me to like continue writing it. That's just another beast. I don't know how y'all do it because it's just talk about spending time imagining a world and finding all the words. It's just
Yeah.
I'm so out of practice with the fiction that right now poetry feels more attainable.
Yeah, yeah, it's all muscle building, right? Like, different muscles develop in different ways. So even, if I were to shift to something like poetry, it would be starting all over. It wouldn't be like, okay, and I can use all this experience and be like, no, this is a different beast. So it's all, yeah. And I always get amazed by writers of the exact same thing that I do who outline, and I don't outline. I'm like, how do you know what happens? Like I don't know till the end. I'm like, oh, I guess that's what happened. So it's everyone's different.
Yeah.
Well, Diego, we're gonna wrap up. Before we do, if you're up for it, we're gonna do a quick storytelling of our own. This is the making up portion of the show. I've selected three books kind of at random. I chose one shelf on my bookshelf, and I chose three books from that shelf. I'm going to have you choose one of those books. We're going to pick a random page and a random sentence. I'm going to read that sentence, and that sentence will be the first sentence and maybe a 2 minute long short story, poem, whatever we want to do. I'll read that sentence. You give me the next sentence or two. I'll do the next sentence or two, and then we'll call it quits, and we'll see where it goes. We can do whatever we want with this. I have Neil Gaiman's Stardust, Goldman's Princess Bride 25th anniversary edition, and Ocean Vuong's On Earth Were Briefly Gorgeous.
Ooh, oh man. Okay. I
So
feel as a poet drawn to Vong, but
yeah.
I want to go with Gaiman. You know what? Gaiman, I am embarrassed to say I have not read any of his work.
Mhm.
I'm familiar with it, but like haven't actually read it. So let's do
Yeah.
that. Keep
I
it exciting.
just saw him in I was at a conference in Iceland last November, and he was there, and just I could just sit and listen to him talk. I mean, he's amazing. So give me a page between 1 and 200.
Let's go page 23.
Right. I'm going to quickly scan it. Um, so I'm going to read this, and then you do whatever you want with it.
All right.
Um, Dustin leaned over toward her, reached a hand up to her face, felt something wet and hot splash against his hand.
The next thing he knew, the skin from his fingers began to curl back, revealing the bionics of what seemed to be some sort of cyber apparatus.
Shaken, Dustin looked her square in the eye and said, "What are you doing to me?"
She looked back, vacant-eyed, and seemed to drift off somewhere, as if the mind searching a web unseen to either of them, but close at hand, as if right behind the eyelids, before clicking back into place, which she said in a low tone, direct, "You know exactly what this is."
Dustin knew that it was a moment to detach from reality, inasmuch as he already had. He took a step back, turned around, scanned the dingy motel room where they had spent the last 3 days, looked on the counter, saw the bag of LSD, tried to convince himself this was all his imagination. But deep down, he knew this was real. Let's call it there.
Love that. Love that.
You went straight for the sci-fi.
I had to. That was cool. That was fun. That was so weird. Awesome.
Yeah, it's funny. I haven't read a lot of Gaiman either. I've read probably 3 or 4 of his works, and they're not all for me because I'm not a big fantasy guy. But again, when you talk about just the craft itself and just appreciating language. It's funny. He's got a book of essays out because he's just a prolific essay writer over the years, various different things, criticism, whatever. That's an amazing book. Just reading his critical essays and his command of language and his accessibility of language. There's just something about it. Like, yeah, I could just read this all day long. So. Well, listen, Diego, what a pleasure to meet you, and congratulations on the release of your debut 10 to 12 year effort collection of poetry. That's got to be, that's got to be so satisfying, and also you probably don't want it to end, because you're like, okay, it's over, like it's out, it's. But that's incredible, and I wish you all the success with it, and I hope we get a chance to meet in person someday. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, thank you so much. What a joy.
All right, take care, Diego. So that's it. That is my conversation with Diego Báez, author of the new poetry collection, Yaguareté White, which I know I am pronouncing terribly wrong. So my apologies to you, Diego. If you want to find out more about Diego, and I highly encourage that you do, please visit him on his website, diegobaez.com. And feel free to pop on over to my website, carterwilson.com, where you can buy my books, you can subscribe to my newsletter, check out my appearances, or if you're a writer, please go to the For Writers section of my website, and you can see some of the offerings that we have under my company, Unbound Writer. We do one-on-one coaching, in-person writing retreats, and we'll soon be offering online classes. So please feel free to check that out. That's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I know I did. More episodes will be out next week. In the meantime, take care.